We're diving into some pretty dark stuff today. A string of murders that terrorized Carroll City, Florida.
Hi.
Back in the 70s?
Oh, yeah. This one is,
That's a tough
tough.
one. It all ends with, well, culminates, I guess, in one of the largest mass murders in Miami-Dade County history, at the time anyway. And the guy behind it all,
Hmm.
John Errol Ferguson. This is where it gets interesting, though.
Okay.
Psychiatrists. They knew this guy had violent tendencies
Mm.
since he was a kid. And Kizidik,
Mm.
get this, he actually bragged about fooling them.
Yeah, that's what makes this case so fascinating. We've got the court records and, of course, the news coverage. But to really understand what happened here, we really got to go beyond all that.
Yeah.
Why did this happen? What put Ferguson on this path? And here's the really unsettling part.
Okay.
What does this tell us about how society deals with people who show these signs, right? These
Yeah.
signs of danger.
You're right. It's not just about the crimes themselves. It's about understanding what led to them. So let's start with Ferguson's early life. I mean, was there anything in his past that hinted at this kind of
Yeah.
dark future?
Well, his childhood. It was anything but stable, that's for sure. His father died when he was just 13, leaving his mother to raise 8 kids in poverty.
Wow.
And Ferguson himself, constantly in trouble. He repeated 9th grade 3 times before dropping out altogether.
That's a lot for a kid to deal with. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a wonder if that kind of environment could
Yeah.
shape someone, you know?
Absolutely. And it's important to remember, we're not making excuses for him, right?
Right.
But understanding his background, it might give us some context for the path he chose.
Sure. So when do we start seeing the red flags? Those signs that something is really wrong?
Well, by 15, Ferguson, he was already on the radar of psychiatrists.
Oh, wow.
They labeled him dangerous, homicidal, someone who should not be released under any circumstances.
Whoa.
Imagine hearing that about a teenager.
I know.
And here's what's even more chilling.
Right.
He later bragged about manipulating those evaluations, essentially saying he was faking insanity.
So even as a kid, professionals knew he was capable of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you wonder if anything could have been done, right? If there were missed opportunities to
Right.
intervene.
That's a question that haunts a lot of these cases, you know?
Yeah.
Was there a point where someone could have intervened and maybe changed things?
I mean,
Tough question.
yeah. And it's even more complex because
Yeah.
Ferguson didn't act alone, right? He had accomplices.
Right.
What about them?
He did. 2 men, Marvin Francois and Buford White, involved in a number of these murders. Their backgrounds are actually pretty different.
Mm.
Francois, he had a rough childhood too. Poverty, abuse. But White's past,
Yeah.
it's more of a mystery. Don't have as much info on him.
So one accomplice with a background similar to Ferguson's.
Mm.
And the other, well, we just don't know. Does that make it harder to understand, I mean, their choices?
It does. It reminds us that there's never one simple explanation for these kinds of things. Human behavior. It's
Yeah.
complicated.
Yeah.
Untangling those threads of motivation.
Well.
It's tough.
So let's get into the timeline of the crimes. The first murders connected to Ferguson, 1974, right?
That's right. October of that year. James Ward and Joseph Walters.
Really?
Ward had escaped from a mental hospital, found shot with a shotgun, and just days later, Walters found dead near some railroad tracks, shot multiple times, with a shotgun, A&D, a handgun.
Were these murders immediately connected to Ferguson?
They were a mystery at first. It wasn't until 77 that a convicted killer named Edward Eugene Oliver, already serving time for Ward's murder, confessed to his role in both killings and named Ferguson as the shooter.
So breaking the case. But was justice served?
Unfortunately, no, not at that time, despite the confession. And Oliver passed a polygraph. The assistant state attorney didn't think there was enough evidence to prosecute Ferguson for these murders.
Wow.
Ferguson was already in jail for something else, but he was about to be paroled.
Oh, no.
The detective on the case, he pushed to file charges, but they missed their window.
Unbelievable.
And Ferguson walked free.
Hard to believe that. A guy known to be violent, implicated in 2 murders, allowed to just walk free, feels like a massive failure.
It definitely raises questions about how these situations are handled.
Yeah.
Could those murders have been prevented? It's impossible to know for sure, but it's a chilling thought.
And the violence didn't end there, right? What happened next?
In May of 77, an elderly couple, Raymond and Catherine Perry, they were found murdered in their motel room in Miami. They had been tied up, beaten, robbed, and shot execution style.
Oh, my God.
Ferguson was never officially charged, but the gun used in the Perry murders, it was later linked to the Carroll City massacre. and the Hialeah murders.
So even though he wasn't charged, there's a connection to Ferguson. This is where we start to see that escalation of violence, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just random, it was a pattern.
Exactly. It's like a horrifying puzzle,
Yeah.
each piece darker and more disturbing. And then the most infamous piece, the Carol City Massacre.
This is the one that made headlines. What happened that night?
July 77. Ferguson, along with Francois White, and a fourth guy, Melvin Archie, decided to rob a drug house in Carol City. Ferguson pretended to be a utility worker, knocked on the door, got let inside.
Oh, wow.
He immediately tied up and blindfolded the woman and let his accomplices in, all masked and armed.
So a planned robbery. How did it turn into a massacre?
Over the next couple hours, 6 more people showed up at the house, each one ambushed, tied up, blindfolded. They had 8 victims. Seems like the plan was robbery at first. But then Francois's mask fell off.
Oh, no.
Revealed his identity. So Ferguson, he made the decision to execute everyone.
8 people held hostage in their own home.
It's terrifying.
Terror they must have felt. And anyone survived.
2 people did. Margaret Wooden and Johnny Hall somehow managed to survive. They turned their heads as the shots were fired. Wooden actually got up and ran for help. Led the police back to that horrific scene.
Hard to believe. It's how something so calculated and brutal was motivated by a robbery. What happened after they fled the scene?
Well, according to Archie, he was the getaway driver. They went back to a motel, split the money. A measly $800.
Wow.
He testified that Francois was bragging about the killings, compared it to the St. Valentine's Day massacre, while White, on the other hand, was visibly shaken, disturbed.
So even within this group,
Yeah.
such different reactions to what they'd done.
Right.
Almost like they were trying to grasp the magnitude of their own brutality. But this didn't last much longer, did it?
No, it didn't. Within a couple of months, police arrested Archie, Francois, and White. But Ferguson was still out there.
Oh, no.
And during that time, he committed 2 more murders. This time, a teenage couple in Hialeah.
Right. The Hialeah murders. He wasn't finished.
This case is particularly disturbing. January 1978, 17-year-old Brian Glenfeld and 17-year-old Belinda Worley. They vanished after a church meeting. Later that night, their bodies were found. Brian had been shot multiple times in his car. Belinda's body was found in a wooded area nearby. She had been raped and then shot in the head.
Another level of brutality. And this time, the victim so young. Did the evidence point to Ferguson?
Oh, there was no doubt. The murder weapon matched the one used in the Carol City Massacre. And the Perry murders.
It's chilling. Even on the run, Ferguson's capacity for violence didn't diminish.
It's like he was on this horrifying trajectory.
And no one could stop him.
But eventually, his luck ran out. April 1978. FBI got a tip, cornered him in an apartment. After a short standoff, he surrendered.
I'm almost relieved to hear that, even though we know it doesn't end there. So Ferguson's captured.
Yeah.
What happens next? What about his accomplices? Did they face justice?
Well, the legal proceedings were complicated, different outcomes for each person. Let's start with Marvin Francois. He was the first to be convicted, sentenced to death for his role in the Carol City Massacre. What's interesting about his case is that he used his final moments to offer a scathing critique of the system.
That sounds like a story in itself.
Yeah.
What about the other accomplices?
Their stories are just as fascinating. There is questions about the fairness and consistency of our legal system. Buford White's case in particular shows just how complicated these issues can be. Remember, he was the lookout. He didn't actually pull the trigger, but his case, it was anything but straightforward.
This is already so much more than just retelling the facts. It's making me think about the choices people make, the systems they're trapped in, and how we as a society deal with the consequences.
Exactly, and we're just getting started. In the next part, we'll delve deeper into the trials and fates of Ferguson's accomplices. You won't want to miss it.
Last time we were talking about John Errol Ferguson, the man behind the Carol City Massacre. We left off with the accomplices facing justice. You mentioned that Marvat Francois, the one who actually pulled the trigger, had quite a story.
Oh, he did. Francois's trial, it offered some pretty chilling details. About that night, testimony revealed that after they'd tied up and blindfolded everyone, Francois actually bragged to the others, saying, "You all are punks. I'm the only one who can shoot somebody." He wanted them to know that he was the only one capable of that kind of brutality.
It's terrifying to hear. I mean, it's one thing to participate, but to boast about it, that's a whole other level.
It really speaks to a level of detachment, from the reality of what he was doing.
Yeah.
Raises questions about what drives someone to not only commit these acts, but to actually revel in them.
Francois was convicted, sentenced to death for his role in the massacre.
Yeah.
But you said his story goes beyond that. What happened?
Well, his execution. It took place on May 29, 1985. In the hours leading up to it, he spent time with his family. He was even granted a last meal: shrimp, lobster tail, barbecued ribs.
It's a strange ritual, isn't it, that last meal?
Yeah,
You have to wonder what's going through their minds.
hard to imagine. But what makes Francois' case so compelling is what happened next.
Okay.
When asked if he had any last words, he read from a prepared statement.
Interesting.
And it wasn't what anyone expected.
What did he say?
He delivered this powerful condemnation of the system. Here's an excerpt. The Miami institutionalized white racist judiciary and law enforcement systems have made me, the once heroin addict, the scapegoat. With fabricated assertions, dishonest policemen, unethical judges, unethical state attorneys, drug pushers, and drug users for their political and personal ambitions and their inability and unwillingness to control the drug sphere of Miami's communities.
Wow. He's blaming the system,
Mm-hmm.
calling out racial injustice,
Yeah.
corruption. It's certainly a different perspective.
It is. He went on to compare his execution to America's actions in Grenada and the bombing of the American embassy in Lebanon. He saw himself as a pawn, a scapegoat, used to distract from bigger issues.
So in his final moments, he chose to make a political statement, using his platform to challenge the system that condemned him.
It makes you think about the power of voice, right? Even in the face of death.
It does.
And he didn't stop there. His final words, delivered with this chilling conviction, were, if there is such a thing as an antichrist, it ain't one man, but the whole white race.
Powerful words. Leaves you with a lot to think about. Here's a man who committed horrific acts, but also felt like a victim of a system rigged against him.
It's a perspective that we don't often hear. We tend to focus on the crimes,
Rightfully so.
on the victims. But Francois' statement, it forces us to consider the complexities of the individuals involved, their motivations, their beliefs.
Even when those beliefs are challenging.
Exactly.
So we've explored Marvin Francois' path, from his troubled upbringing to his participation in the massacre, and finally to his defiant last words. It's a story that sticks with you.
It does. And it raises so many questions about justice, culpability, the human capacity for both good and evil.
What about Buford White, the lookout during the massacre?
Oh.
His story seemed particularly complex, especially considering he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. Where does his story fit into all of this?
White's case is really where we see the legal system wrestling with those nuances of culpability.
Okay.
He was there, he participated, but he didn't actually kill anyone.
Right.
So how do you punish someone for their role without minimizing the crime itself?
It's a question that's probably debated in courtrooms every day.
It is. And White's story highlights just how difficult it can be to find that answer.
Yeah.
Remember, he was ultimately sentenced to death, but it wasn't a straight path.
There were twists and turns, appeals, even a judge overriding the jury's recommendation. It sounds like his case really tested the system.
It did. Exploring those details will offer a fascinating glimpse into how justice is sought, and sometimes how it falls short.
We've been talking about the legal system and
Yeah.
how it deals with these really horrific crimes. We've looked at John Errol Ferguson, the mastermind behind it all, and Marvin Francois, the one who carried out those executions during the Carroll City Massacre. Now let's look at Buford White
The lookout.
and how his case was different.
White's case is so interesting because it really makes you think about the gray areas of the law,
Yeah.
He was there at the massacre, but he didn't actually hurt anyone. So where's the line? When is someone's involvement enough to warrant the same punishment as the person who actually committed the murders?
That's a tough one. Seems like his defense team really focused on that, right? During the trial.
They did. Their argument was that White, he was a reluctant participant, essentially forced into being there by Ferguson. They painted him as horrified by the violence,
Okay.
but too afraid to intervene or even run away.
So they tried to separate him from the actual brutality, emphasizing that he didn't pull the trigger. Did the jury buy it?
It seems like they did, at least to some extent. After deliberating for hours, they surprised everyone. By recommending a life sentence for White, they felt that his role, while criminal, didn't warrant the death penalty.
Sounds like a victory for the defense.
It did. But then the Judge Ellen Morphonios Gable, decided to overrule the jury's recommendation and sentenced White to death.
A judge overruling a jury. That's pretty rare, isn't it?
It is. Caused a lot of controversy. Judge Gable's reasoning was that White's prior criminal record, robbery, assault charges, show that he was a danger to society.
So even though he didn't kill anyone that night, his past came back to haunt him.
It did.
It makes you think about how much weight the system puts
Hmm.
on past offenses,
Yeah.
Is it fair to punish someone for what they might do based on what they've done before?
That's a question at the heart of a lot of legal debates.
Yeah.
And in White's case, it led to years of appeals and legal battles.
Wow.
His death sentence was actually overturned in 1984, and he's resentenced to life in prison.
Okay.
But then the state appealed that, and in 1985, the Florida Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty.
There's a much back and forth, all these legal twists and turns, almost like the system itself couldn't figure out what justice should look like.
It really highlights the challenges and the inconsistencies that can come up when trying to apply the law to these really complex situations.
So what happened to White in the end? Did he face the same fate
Yeah.
as Ferguson and Francois?
He did. Buford White was executed in the electric chair on August 28th, 1987.
Wow.
Unlike Francois, who used his last words to make that statement,
Right.
White just said, "No, sir," when asked if he had anything to say.
A quiet end to a very tumultuous life.
Mhm.
Makes you think about all those paths not taken, the choices made
Yeah.
and how they ripple outward.
Absolutely. This deep dive into the Carroll City murders, it wasn't just about the details of the crime.
Right.
It was about exploring those nuances of the legal system, the gray areas, how individuals respond to these unimaginable situations.
We saw Ferguson,
Mm.
driven by this darkness maybe we'll never fully understand. We heard Francois blaming the system for his fate,
Yeah.
and then White, whose silence leaves us with more questions than answers.
We examined court records, news clippings, even the last words of those involved. But I think the most important takeaway is that behind every headline, every statistic, there are human stories filled with complexities and contradictions. And it's by exploring those stories, even the difficult ones, that we can start to understand the true cost of violence and the challenge of seeking justice.
It's a lot to think about. You've really hit the nail on the head. These aren't just cases. They're stories about real people, about the choices they made, and the impact those choices had on so many lives.
It's easy to get caught up in the sensationalism of true crime,
Yeah,
but what we've done here, it's different.
I think so.
We took the time to think about the why behind these events, the motivations, the circumstances, the systemic issues.
It's about understanding.
Exactly.
I encourage you to keep thinking about this. What are your thoughts on the roles they played? How do you feel about the sentences? There are no easy answers here. But by engaging with these tough questions, maybe we can contribute to a more informed and compassionate understanding of the world around us.